Ladies and gentlemen, greetings. Welcome, welcome. Thanks for making it here in this cold weather outside. It is an honor to have you. Just want to, before we introduce our distinguished speaker by another board member, let me make a couple of announcements. In the past few months, we have had speakers who talked on very difficult and very sad subjects, the anti-Semitism, genocide, and issues that we need to know more about, educate ourselves and educate our children and grandchildren in the hope that those events don't ever happen again, which happened against the Armenians, against the Jews, against the Gypsies, and so many other people that we are learning about. I am honored to know that Keene State has a program that is teaching genocide and educating people. We had 3-4 speakers on that subject. Now we have a distinguished speaker telling us about the problem of the universe, the world, our environment, and what is happening, and you will hear a great speakers. Just want to let you know about our next 3 speakers, which is going to be on world peace. Next month, which is on March 19th, I believe, 18th. Professor David Adams will be speaking on cultural peace. He has spent almost 40 years of his life doing work on peace, building peace, working in the United Nations, and he will enlighten us as to what is happening in various parts, making peace, understanding and educating people about the peace, and what else we need to do in order to move more toward peaceful movement among ourselves, among our nations, and that would be 18th of March. I hope if you are free, you can join us. On April 22nd, we have Dr. Teresa Seibert, who will speak on post-genocide peace building and in Rwanda, and she will be also educating us as to what we could have learned, what we can learn, what are the lessons that we can learn from Rwanda and what happened there and what brought peace and how the peace was brought. On May, we have the honor of having John Hagan, who happened to be attending this meeting tonight, sitting here. And Mr. Hagan will be speaking on Niger, politics and situation in Niger and the role of United States, and hopefully he will let us know what lessons we can learn from that situation, that tragic situation, that we can prevent that situation happen in other parts of the world, and again for the better improvement of the world peace and humanitarian affairs. Many of you may know we have a list here of those who want to become a member of Wyndham World Affairs. Please write and sign, become a member if you like. Minor fee, few hamburgers a month, that's all. If you want to be on the list and be informed of all these activities we have, there's another list. You can put your name and your address or your email, and my dear wife will be sending information out all the time, letting you know what Wyndham World Affairs is doing. And those of you who have made some contribution, we are most honored. We are here, everybody works as volunteer. Jawad is one of the key workers, the speakers and others. Everybody is working just on their own to make the world a better world for us, for our children and grandchildren. And if anybody can help a little bit, whenever you can, that would be fine. With that, Renata, please come and introduce our Professor Renata Gabor.
Right. So I'm Renate Gebauer. I am teaching at Keene State College. I'm a tree hugger. And I happen to be also on the WWAC, the World, what is it called? Wyndham World Affairs Council board meeting. And I really enjoy being on the board, and we were reflecting on whom could we invite, and it happened, I get an email from my friend Paul Morgan, who happened, it was in December, he sent us an email from Paris, and then I thought, that is a really great idea to actually invite him, because if we think about world affairs, how can we not talk about the environment? I know Paul from, we are both on a steering committee of a Buddhist monastery, and we are doing the Earth Initiative. And I learn a lot. He's also teaching sustainability. I'm teaching sustainability. I'm actually usually stealing a lot of his ideas he brings to the meeting. He's teaching at the Westchester University of Pennsylvania. He's also a very active member at the Amazon Center for Environmental Education and Research, and takes groups of adults and also students to Peru to think about environmental issues in the other part of the world. So we have a common interest there. He got his degree from his Ph.D. from Columbia, and he's a great guy.
So thank you for the very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. Came from Pennsylvania. I haven't been to Vermont or New Hampshire in a while. It's really nice to be up here with you. So yes, we're going to talk about the Paris Climate Agreement this evening. As you all know, I've probably heard it was, there was an agreement, all right, which was a big deal. Absolutely. What that means, well, we're going to sort of try to dig into that this evening. But we're going to have to back up a little bit just to provide context, because it wasn't just something that happened, in 2 weeks in December of 2015. There was lots of buildup and failures and successes along the way. So I want to make sure we provide the context to really fully appreciate what this means and doesn't mean, all right? So the problem, very briefly, I think we are familiar with this. Too much energy, electricity generation from fossil fuels, transportation, cow flatulence, deforestation. This is the problem, all right? Meaning we have more CO2 in the atmosphere now than in a very, very long time. That means there's an increase in temperature. The hottest years on record have happened within the last certainly 15 years. And as you probably heard or were aware, 2015 was the hottest year on record, all right? That must mean something, indeed. So there has been quite a good history of climate science going back to the 1800s. So it's not something that we discovered recently, that there might be problem with pumping CO2 and CO2 other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But it was really kind of in the late 20th century that started getting serious. This is James Hansen, probably one of the most renowned climate scientists, testifying before Congress about his research on climate science. Al Gore was there to listen to him, of course, and he'll be a recurring theme this evening. And basically, he said that climate change is happening, all right? At the same time, we had the development of the IPCC, which was 1988. This was a UN body charged with doing these kinds of things. They don't actually do the research, but they aggregate and analyze and synthesize all the research that's going on over the planet on climate change. And over the years, they have been able to pretty much conclude, yes, the planet is warming, and yes, it's caused by humans. So by 2013, the reports came out saying we have a more than 95% certainty that humans are doing this, all right? More than 95% is as good as it gets in science and just about any other field, all right? If someone told you there's a 95% chance your house is going to burn down, you're going to do something about it. You do not bet on the long shot. You do not pray that maybe the 4% or 5% is going to win the day, all right? So it's pretty much as guaranteed, all right? If you want to talk about the reality of climate change, we can take it into the parking lot afterwards, all right? So the global response. Significant events, we're not going to go into all these, but 1992 was really the beginning of something significant when we begin to do something. 1997, I think somebody mentioned they were at COP3 here in the group. There he is in the back, which was Kyoto. The Kyoto Protocol went into effect in 2005. 2009 was the big Copenhagen summit, which was a failure. But the key events really start with, like I said, the UN Environment Summit in Rio in 1992. And yes, that's Al Gore there. This was sort of famous because our president then, George H.W. Bush, George Sr., sort of famously said, the American way of life is not up for negotiation. This has been one of those key challenges all along, is how can we address climate change if we're not willing to take a look in the mirror and see how what we're doing is affecting the climate and how it impacts really everybody else on the planet, all right? And so out of that 1992 Rio Earth Summit came the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is the global body charged with sort of addressing climate change, basically, all right? So these are the key elements I will summarize here, but they're charged with stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. In other words, making sure that we don't put too much in, anthropogenic meaning human-caused, and we need to focus on three other things. Making sure that ecosystems can adapt in a timely way, that we do not endanger food production, and that we do this in a way that we allow developing countries to continue to develop sustainably, all right? Because we present a model of development, and if we say, too bad, the rest of you are going to have to forego this, that's a non-starter, all right? So we have to build in sustainable development into this, all right? So an important note, and if you've been paying attention to politics lately, I think you'll know where this is going. The Paris Agreement was negotiated under the UNFCCC. It's a treaty with 195 parties that was ratified by the U.S. in 1992 with advice and consent from the Senate, right? It was ratified and approved, all right? So one of the questions now is with the Paris Agreement, what does it mean? Does it have to be ratified in the U.S. Senate? If that was going to happen, it would not happen because the U.S. Senate will not ratify anything dealing with climate change right now, all right? So one possibility, it's a really legal issue in many ways, and a lot of kind of effort had to be put into making sure that this was something that the U.S. could sign without having to bring to the U.S. Senate. So exactly how that plays out, we're going to see over the next year because people will insist that it be brought to the Senate, and Obama will probably have to insist that no, this was ratified and this was an extension of that, an annex to this, or whether he can do it under presidential power. These are going to be one of these sticky issues because if the U.S. cannot be a full party to this, it really undermines the whole thing. Because then other countries say, well, if the U.S. isn't going to play, why should we? Right? Because the U.S. is one of the largest emitters. But it's not the largest. That would be China. So let's go to COP3 a little bit. This is the Kyoto Protocol, which had legally binding commitments and this other issue, which we'll talk about in some detail, common but differentiated responsibilities. Built into the UN Framework Convention is this idea that some nations have more of a historical responsibility for our climate challenges than others, all right? The U.S. being one of the leaders because we've been pumping CO2 and CO2 equivalents into the atmosphere for a long time. So the idea was that we would set up different groups of countries. The Annex I countries were the ones who were historically responsible. Then there was the other groups who were going to be paying, and then there were the non-annex countries who were the developing countries who were not obligated to do anything. And in that group was China and India. And if they don't have to do anything, you can imagine what people say because, well, come on, they're big emitters now. Why is this fair? You know, so it comes down to kind of, middle school arguments. That's not fair. We have to cut, but they don't. Why? And so that was sort of one reason why the Kyoto Protocol was a non-starter in the U.S. We signed it, but did not ratify it. All right. Canada eventually pulled out in 2012. All right. So Kyoto Protocol was the first big effort under the UN framework to try to address climate change. But immediately after that went into effect, we were sort of looking toward the next agreement, one that would be sort of binding for all countries on the planet, all right? And so this went into effect in 2005, and not long after, 2009, you have the Copenhagen COP. COP meaning Conference of the Parties to the UN Convention on Climate Change, all right? there was tremendous hope leading up to this, thinking that this was going to be the opportunity to have a Kyoto Protocol successor that was going to have everybody involved with legally binding commitments to really finally address the challenge of climate change. People went in calling it Copenhagen because this was going to happen. It turned out to be Nopenhagen, all right? It didn't work. It was a huge flop, and it really kind of submarined a lot of the efforts because we're thinking if we can't have some kind of global agreement on this, what will happen, all right? And so after that, efforts were made to begin, oh, there was the bad news, sorry. We'll get to the story. So there were efforts to do something. But before we get there, I want to tell you how I kind of got involved in this. As Dr. Gebauer said, I'm involved with the board of the Amazon Center for Environmental Education and Research. We do mostly work in the Amazon basin of Peru, doing basic environmental education for remote schools and for teachers to provide, kind of opportunities for young people to appreciate what they're in the midst of, which is, this tremendous rainforest and biodiversity, all right? So we knew that COP20, which is in December 2014, was going to be in Lima, all right, in Lima, Peru. So we decided in 2013 to apply to become an official observer organization. These COP events are really interesting because they're simultaneously high-level negotiations with leaders of all the countries, academic conferences because there are people there doing making presentations on everything from adaptation and mitigation to what's going to happen in the cryosphere and on and on and on to education, but also kind of what they call like a county fair, exhibits and demonstrations and colorful stuff. And so it's an opportunity to rub shoulders with the people doing the most important and interesting work around the planet. And so we wanted to be at that game. It was going to be in Lima. And so we received official observer status and sent people there. So that was fantastic. There's Peru. And then we waited, and 2014 turned out to be, in many ways, an auspicious year for climate science and climate policy. What happened that year? Well, there was first a frenzy of climate change reports coming out from the IPCC and other organizations. So in January, you had the IPCC report on the physical science basis saying more than 95% likelihood that it's human caused and we need to do something. In February, the National Academy of Sciences and the Royal Society put out this piece basically saying, folks, climate change is real, we need to do something about it. This piece and this piece by the American Association for the Advancement of Science were somewhat unusual because typically the scientific approach is to publish the data and leave it up to the policymakers to do something about it. But unfortunately, the scientists were realizing the policymakers are not really paying attention. We're telling them that this is serious, but they're not taking it seriously. They're saying, no, this is really serious. You really need to pay attention to this. So it's an unusual step for scientists to try to step outside of that, often that frame of pure objectivity to say we need to do something about this because we mean it and it's real. And so these were kind of unusual reports in many ways. The IPCC comes out with more in April, and in May the National Climate Assessment, which is developed by the US government, was put out. It's kind of like our own IPCC report. And that basically said climate change is not something that's going to be happening in the future. It's happening right now, and we need to do something about it. All right? So that was just the first 5 months. And then in September, at the political level, there was an effort in New York City at the UN by Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, to, as he said, catalyze action. We were going to be having the COP20 in Lima that December, all aiming toward hopefully an agreement in December of 2015. But we needed to catalyze action. And so he opens this big conference at the UN. President Obama was there. Leonardo DiCaprio was there, probably when he was filming Revenant because he had this hair. I don't know. Al Gore was there, of course. And outside was this. This was a huge climate march. This was the largest climate march possibly ever anywhere in history. Dr. Gebauer and I were there in the streets, hundreds of thousands of people saying, we want you to take this seriously. Leaders tend to lead when the rest of the country tends to say, it's time for you to lead. All right? And so coming out in force was big and essential. And of course, Al Gore was marching with Bill de Blasio, Ban Ki-moon. This is Jane Goodall. And this is Laurent Fabius, who was the then president of the COP in Paris in 2015. So all of this was sort of trying to gather the energy to make sure there was an agreement in 2015. All right? in addition to that, and this is perhaps the most significant event, there was an agreement between China and the United States, sort of a bilateral agreement to reduce emissions. That happened in November. The idea was that these two countries combined account for 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. Right? As I mentioned, in the Kyoto Protocol, China was obligated to do nothing. And yet China is now the biggest emitter on the planet. And so the U.S. pledged by 2025 to reduce our emissions 26 to 28%. And China agreed to a 20% reduction, renewable, and really moving to renewables. Without that bilateral agreement saying we're serious about this, the countries who are also big emitters would have been given no incentive to sort of ante up. Because if China and the US aren't in, why should they bother? Because we're such a huge chunk of the problem, all right? So that was tremendous sort of momentum going into the Lima summit. So there we are in Lima. They had a beautiful symbol and everything. And there were a number of issues. There was never really any hope of having some final agreement there. It was all focused on Paris. But it was sort of orchestrated so that we can address some significant issues in December of 2014, work on them through the calendar year 2015, and then hopefully get an agreement in December. So there were issues of equity, CBDR, which I mentioned before. If you do UN stuff, it's all about the acronyms. Common but differentiated responsibilities. The idea that we're big emitters, so everybody has a piece to play, but our piece is bigger because we're big emitters, all right? Green Climate Fund, meaning we need to provide money to poor countries to make the transition to renewables and address other problems. And then this was kind of the big thing, the INDCs, Intended Nationally Determined Contributions. Sounds dull, but this was basically, what are you going to bring to the table? Instead of requiring countries to do something, it was more of a voluntary approach. Instead of saying, this is what you must do, it was organized like a potluck, all right? So Paris was going to be a carbon potluck. And the countries had to pledge sometime between December of 2014 and December of 2015 how much they were planning to reduce, all right? Their intended nationally determined contribution, all right? And so it worked kind of like peer pressure because you don't want to propose something that's too little, otherwise it's embarrassing, but you can't propose too much, otherwise you can't do it, all right? And so the INDCs are a critical feature of the agreement that was eventually reached, all right? So we'll listen for that. The other thing, like I said, that common but differentiated responsibility, sort of already laid it out, but not only is that, the largest countries must do more and pay more, we needed to do this in a way that will allow the poorer countries to develop, right? So that's built in. So one of the things that was sort of hashed out a lot in Lima in 2014 was the Green Climate Fund. The idea here was, let me just back up, they were going to provide $100 billion a year starting in 2020 to the poorest countries so they can transition to renewables and hopefully sort of leapfrog and not have to rely on coal and other fossil fuels. But that costs money, of course. So the challenge was, what kinds of pledges were the developed countries making? And at this point, it was rolling in very slowly. There were lots of complaints about the Green Climate Fund, which is why the piggy bank was saying, I'm starving, we need to get more money to help the poor countries do this. All right? So that's one of those critical issues. Now, as I said, the INDCs, the Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, central to this. And so this is what it looked like in Lima. I was there with, these were other members of the Amazon Center for Environmental Education and Research, Carmen Chavez, who's our Peru director, and Armando Vasquez, who teaches sort of science there. This is sort of a sense of what the venue is like. These are the big negotiating halls where you've probably seen it on the news. Everybody's gathered in there. It was nice weather in December because it's the southern hemisphere. Sitting in the grass, drinking the Peru's national drink, which is the Pisco Sour, very nice. And I was attending events like this because there's lots of side stuff. This was doing climate change education because I'm basically an educator and this is the stuff that I'm interested in. So a lot of good stuff. But there were also panels of youth because obviously youth have a bigger stake in this than other folks, all right? Many of us in this room will be retired or expired in 2050, but these folks will still be around and they need to have a seat at the table at the very least. It's their future. So Secretary Kerry was there. This is Todd Stern, the US's chief climate negotiator. Secretary Kerry was wonderful to see at these things. He's been involved for a long time in these climate negotiations. He's very eloquent. He actually speaks other languages. He's not an embarrassment to the United States when he gets up and talks. It's really kind of refreshing to hear him speak about these things. So it was a success in that we made good progress. This is Manuel Pulgar Vidal, who is the environment minister for Peru. He was the president of the COP while it was in Lima. And we can then begin Al Gore was there. Did I mention that? Good. Then we can begin sort of the serious run-up to Paris, because this is where the action is. So this is 2015 now, all right? The INDCs, we're kind of waiting for countries to submit their pledges of how much it's going to be. But late in the year, nearly every country on Earth had submitted a pledge. So already this is tremendous progress, meaning we've got almost everybody involved. Which is fantastic. A few countries are still getting it together at the last minute, but most of them, pulled it together in time. The United States' INDC, as I mentioned, was basically the agreement that they made with China. That was our pledge to reduce 17% in 2020 using 2005 levels, et cetera. All right? That's our pledge. One little aside here, if you want to pay attention to the politics, this is basically President Obama's Clean Power Plan. All right, we're reducing the power plant emissions, mostly coal, but that was recently stopped by the Supreme Court, and then a Supreme Court justice died. And so you see how domestic politics plays with this, and some people are concerned that if the United States can't make good on its pledge via the Clean Power Plan, then the entire Paris Agreement unravels, because we are essentially out, and then China says, well, if we had an agreement, if you're out, we're out. And then India goes, and then pretty soon you have lots of small countries who don't see any reason to participate, all right? And so a lot rides on what happens domestically over the next year, and that's something for all of us to pay attention to, which is why I'm really paying attention to the elections, because there are people we could elect who would love to see this agreement die, and there are people we could elect who would love to see it thrive, all right? And so that's a critical issue. So this happened on the way there too. Does anybody know what came out in June 18th, 2015? In fact, it was the Pope's encyclical. This was interesting timing, of course, because we were trying to build up momentum for a climate agreement. His encyclical addresses climate change, but other ecological issues. Sophisticated critique. I read the whole thing, actually the day after it came out. Really worth a read if you haven't read it, because it really puts climate change and other ecological issues in a sort of a moral and ethical and obviously a spiritual context. Fascinating stuff. Worth reading. It's in multiple languages too. So, and he addressed a joint session of Congress, the United States. Boehner there, that was one of the last days in his job, who actually, because Boehner's a Catholic, was probably very torn by what the Pope had to say. Joe Biden looking smug, right? So anyway, but the Pope didn't come primarily to talk to Congress. He went primarily to make a presentation at the UN, where something else was going on. And it wasn't specifically climate change. It had to do with this, because it was the inauguration of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We were reaching the end of the Millennium Development Goals, which were expiring in 2015. And we were launching, inaugurating, formally, initiating the Sustainable Development Goals. And a lot of people in the U.S. don't pay attention to this stuff, because it's like, yeah, whatever, international things, we don't need to pay attention to that. And yet this is central to international conversation and policy. And it's worth noting that climate action is one of the goals, all right? So when we talk about climate change, it's not the only thing going on. Climate change is one piece of a very large puzzle having to do with how do we live sustainably on the planet for the long haul. And we can't do that just by hammering this one issue, all right? All of these things are connected. We need to be able to walk, chew gum, and comb our hair at the same time. I think we can do that, but we need to be paying attention to all this stuff. And they're in some kind of fundamental, if you want to leave like Maslow's hierarchy here. Because people will not do anything about climate change or other critical issues if they're in poverty, if they're hungry, they don't have good health or education, or if there's no gender equity, or if they don't have clean water, all right? And so those things are essential. And we need to be able to talk about climate change in the context of this other stuff. And as we found out in the run-up to Paris, I was kind of rudely awakened to this, because I remember I was actually driving New York State, and I was thinking about this, and I had to pull the car over to make a few notes, because it suddenly dawned on me. All of us people who are interested in sustainable development are usually talking a good game. It's not just the environment, it's social stuff too, and economic, it all fits together. But then, we forget about like peace and justice issues. And as you know, in the run-up to Paris, there was this, right? Right, so this kind of said, so I was like, there was calls for maybe canceling the COP, the climate meeting, because it was going to be too dangerous. It was certainly changed, but it was suddenly, it's like, how can we deal with these environmental problems if we have these social problems as well, all right? And it's fundamental that we be able to address these. And one of the failures, you could say, of the U.S. education system is it helps us think in sort of narrow ways. It doesn't help us think in systems. We don't connect things. We don't connect the dots. We're good at like boring down into one question. I have a Ph.D., which is learning a whole lot about very little. But we don't do a lot of, we have like deep vertical rigor, but not a lot of rigor laterally, all right? So in this century, we need to be able to think laterally with rigor to really connect those dots. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to address anything, okay? So that's the critical thing. It turned out that this Copenhagen, this sort of the logo here was quite brilliant in a way, because there was an idea behind it. The logo symbolizes the blue planet, a network of lines, one for each nation, make up a complex structure heading towards unrest or balance. It could be either one, all right? And so the Paris conference went ahead. The French decided it was too important. They doubled down. But there were restrictions on demonstrations and other kinds of things. And we decided to go as well. So there was some doubt. So that was kind of the lead up to the conference. Very heady, no doubt about it. So a few things about the COP, the Conference of the Parties in Paris. It was the largest number of participants in UNFCCC history, more than 30,000 people, 19,000 government officials, 2,000 intergovernmental officials, more than 6,000 NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and that was sort of what I was representing, and lots of media, largest COP venue. It was out on this sort of airport here. And this, perhaps most significantly, the largest number of heads of state ever gathered in one place, under one roof. So they couldn't even do a straight-on photo. There were so many heads of state. And the French sort of were very savvy about this. Typically at these events, they bring the heads of state in at the end to force an agreement. They said, no, we're going to bring them in at the beginning. We're going to get things started right off the bat, and to make sure we have tremendous momentum so that we can get an agreement. All right? So that was... that in itself said something. If you bring 150 heads of state in at the beginning, there better be an agreement, all right? Because they're going to expect it. Obviously, President Obama was there. I was there. Big deal. At these things, part of the event is there's each nation or block of nations has sort of an expo area in one of the halls. And they were constantly sort of bringing people through the U.S. expo area. This is the U.S. Secretary of Energy, Ernest Moniz. This is, what's his name from California? Jerry Brown, thank you.
That's Jerry Brown.
Jerry Brown, yeah, he's still kicking. I'm not sure who those guys are. But, and that's me shouldering the burden of the planet. This was an area that was open to the public, to provide education and presentations and things. Every country had a pillar like this. Ours had been defaced. The United States, we don't have a good reputation everywhere. I don't know if you've heard about this. But yeah. Attended press conferences. One of the large groups of people represented are indigenous peoples who have a stake in this, because forested nations and deforestation are actually huge climate change issues. One of the biggest contributors to deforestation, to climate change is deforestation. All right? So that's central. Al Gore was there too. And I will say, he gave an incredibly rousing presentation. He's been involved in this, as I've indicated, from the beginning. People have made jokes about him, but he's done more than just about anybody else in the United States to make sure that we're making progress on things. So he starts off kind of in his Tennessee drawl, and by the end, there was a standing ovation. It was really, really quite impressive. but we also visited the Place de la République, which was the sort of informal memorial for the victims of the November 13th attacks. And then there was an agreement, all right? We weren't in the hall because it's sort of strange because a lot of this stuff's happening behind closed doors. So we found out about it when we were in a hotel room and then had to read about it like everybody else through the New York Times. But we were there, still there, and all the issues sort of become out. So let me go through the key issues because this is kind of the nitty-gritty. We're going to march through these sort of one by one, but I'll give you the overview. There's the issue of temperature. You've all heard probably about 2 degrees. Do we need to limit it to that or something? Finance. How are we going to pay for this? Differentiation. It's like, what are the relative burdens for different countries? Emissions objectives. What are we going to do by 2050? Burden sharing, which will sort of wrap in with finance. The review mechanism. What about those contributions? And then climate damage. Because while we might be concerned about climate change in this country, other countries aren't just concerned, they're terrified. Because if you live in an island nation, this is an existential question. Is your island nation going to survive through the century or not? All right? And whose responsibility is it to pay for the loss and damage inflicted on them by in many cases, through no actions of their own? Right? So, number one, temperature. The objective was to keep the temperature based on pre-industrial levels 2 degrees centigrade. Now, the problem is 2 degrees is a death sentence for island nations. Almost certainly the sea levels will rise and engulf them. And so what was a success was there was mention of 1.5 degrees, which a lot of scientists will tell you that really should be the target, or lower. But it's in the language of the agreement, it says, well, we'll try to work toward 1.5. So it's a little vague, it's a little wishy-washy. So it's sort of moving us in that direction, but even 2 degrees is going to be incredibly ambitious, all right? So that's one of the big questions. With hope, we have hope if we aim for 1.5. If it's 3, forget about it. Now here's the problem, all right? If we do nothing, business as usual, we're going to lock in by 2100, 4.5 degrees centigrade. That's 8.1 degrees Fahrenheit, all right? And you might think, oh, that sounds like a nice warm day. But if when you think about a climate system, or any kind of system, and if your temperature goes up 3 degrees, how do you feel? Not so good. 4 degrees, 5 degrees, pretty soon you're done, all right? And so that change in average temperature is absolutely significant because it completely changes the system, all right? So the INDCs, if you add up the pledges and we sort of project it in the future, that's going to get us to 3.5 degrees centigrade by 2100. Nowhere close to 2, all right? So it's nice to have a potluck style, but we ask people to bring pledges to the party, and it doesn't add up to enough, all right? Enough what science tells us we need. So we needed bigger contributions, but they're not there yet. So there is a mechanism to address this, but that's the challenge. How do we get it down to maybe 1.8 or 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit? How do we do that? So in that sense, it's an agreement, but it's an agreement to, cause disasters for other countries if we don't do anything else, all right? So 1.5 degrees is sort of the new number, all right? It's the new number. Keep that in mind. Finance, the Green Climate Fund. There's a floor of $100 billion per year by 2020, all right? That means $100 billion every year to transfer to poor countries to begin to do the transition to low carbon, all right? They're going to update that by 2025. The U.S. has contributed $3,000 million, which is $3 billion. Japan's a big contributor, UK, Germany, thank you, Renata, France and Sweden. But if you look at this on a per capita basis, the US doesn't come close to near top 10. Thank you, Luxembourg. Thank you, Norway. Thank you, Sweden. That's those socialist Northern Europeans who are always embarrassing us, right? China, they're not in there either. All right? So the other issue, and this is something that is sort of a cause for hope in a way, because that $100 billion sounds like a lot. Nothing compared to the U.S. military budget, of course. But that would help us transition. But there is a possibility that we would have access to a lot more money. And this is why at the event there was an awful lot of conversation about the market signal, the business signal, all right? There were lots of corporations represented there, from Walmart, Kellogg's, IKEA, and on and on and on. Why are they there? Because they're listening for the signal. And that's going to be, are we going to through national or international policies, basically say fossil fuels are done. We are all going to be shifting to renewables. If that's the case, there's trillions of dollars sloshing around in fossil fuel investments, right? And if we get the message that the future is renewables, all that money sloshing around over here can start shifting to something else. And not $100 billion a year, but trillions of dollars a year, all right? Because people are going to want to invest in this. If they find out that countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia and North America are all going to be moving in a big way toward renewables, that's where the action is, all right, through policy. And so there's potential there to really see something that's much more than $100 billion. But it's going to depend on, how serious people are about this and what kinds of actions are actually going to be taken, all right? In terms of evidence of this, in 2004, $60 billion US was spent on sort of global investment in renewables. By 2014, that had gone up to $310 billion globally, all right? So it's already beginning this shift. This is kind of the writing on the wall for the fossil fuel industry. Are they going to go down without a fight? Absolutely not, because we've got too much invested in ExxonMobil and BP and everybody else. Huge players. Whether they're in the room or not, they are the elephant in the room. All right? So, differentiation. Developed countries in this agreement must continue to take the lead in addressing climate change because we're responsible. And other countries are encouraged to enhance their efforts. Well, here's the challenge, all right? So China now is the biggest emitter. United States is big, Europe, India, Russia, all right? So yes, we should all contribute something. But if we look historically, this goes back to 1850, then the picture changes somewhat. Here's the United States, here's the European Union, all right? Huge emitters historically, which means when you put that stuff up in the atmosphere, it doesn't just fall out, it's cumulative, right? And so we've been having a party for a long time, pumping emissions up there, and now new people are coming to the table and they'd like to live our lifestyle too, all right? But we've gotten used to a high lifestyle. It's hard for us to give up anything. So I'm going to give you a sense of how this looks historically. We've got, this is the usual thing. This population, China's big. Wealth, we're big. Extraction, emissions, consumption, and now we're going to look to historical, all right? Historical responsibility for emissions. Whoa. So suddenly the United States and the European Union, we're the ones on the hook for most of the problem, all right? So should we be on the hook for solving the problem? When you talk to other representatives from other countries at the COP event, this is what they point to. They said, we don't forget history. We need to remember history, because in their eyes, we owe them a carbon debt, right? We've been at it a long time. So how are we going to make good on it? If you're in Bangladesh, you've done almost nothing to contribute to the problem of climate change. But if you live in Bangladesh, you're one of the first countries that's going to go underwater as a result of climate change. And who's going to pay to have all those people resettled, provide opportunities for them elsewhere? The Indians are not excited about this. Can you imagine those folks, sort of us picking them up and bringing them to the United States? We had trouble dealing with a few Syrian refugees. What's going to happen when we've got refugees from all over the world wanting to come here because we contributed so much to the problem that ruined their lives? All right? Those are the kinds of critical questions we need to address. All right? So there's reserves. People at risk. This means, are we at risk? No. And that's the other problem, is that we're not likely to be able to be feeling directly the effects of climate change because the risky areas are in other places. There are people at risk, and there's folks at risk from sea level change. We have a little bit more of this here, and the eastern seaboard has problems. Don't buy any property in Miami. It's going to be one of the first to go underwater, okay? But all up and down the eastern, New York City, Washington, D.C., Boston, so that's the challenge. And then poverty, the people least able to pay, all right? So the problem is largely elsewhere, and how's that going to be addressed? Huge equity, justice, fairness questions, all right? So number 4, emissions objectives. The aim here is for greenhouse gas emissions to peak as soon as possible, hopefully by 2050. The idea is that by 2050, we get to kind of net zero emissions. We'll have reduced greenhouse gas emissions and hopefully increased ways of sequestering carbon. So we need to decarbonize our economy, decarbonize the economy, because right now carbon is sort of driving the whole thing. There's ways to sort of capture carbon. One of the nice ways is to plant more trees, all right? But there are other sort of schemes. Some of them really haven't been tested much yet, but a lot of the agreement sort of relies on technologies that haven't been fully developed and proven yet. to be able to sequester carbon, to sort of inject it underground, to hide it under your bed. I don't know where we're going to put it, but we've got to put it somewhere, all right? So that's the idea. The other critical issue, as I mentioned before, is the INDCs right now do not add up to what the science tells us we need, all right? We're nowhere close to that. So we've got something built into this agreement, which is a ratchet mechanism. And this basically says we're going to put in a procedure for increasing our ambition every 5 years. So it's going to look like this. Starting in 2018, we're going to go back to countries and say, okay, in 2015, you said you're going to contribute this to the potluck. Can you do a little more? And then we're going to ask you again in 2023. You need to do more. And ratcheting it up so we can eventually get to a point where we can get to 2 or lower, hopefully 1.5. So this is basically mapping it out from now till the middle of the century, 2050. It's a long-range game. We need to get started right now. As it is right now, we're nowhere close. So is it a good agreement? Well, we've taken a step, all right? We've got many, many more steps to go. And we need to make good on all of these things, otherwise there's problems down the line. Along the way, you've got more IPCC reports. And by the way, these are plans without nuclear and without coal to really going to try to get to 100% renewables by 2050, all right? That's a challenge, no doubt about it. So what have we done? In essence, kick the can down the road. We've got an agreement now, but we're kicking the can down the road because it's politically impossible to pledge the kinds of cuts that we need to actually address the challenge right now. So we need to sort of progressively do it, all right? So this is kind of what's going on. Yes, we've agreed to have an agreement to talk about agreeing on something again later, all right? Meanwhile, we're headed toward the iceberg. So some folks have said the real ratchet mechanism is going to be pressure from people, from grassroots level, making sure that we hold people accountable, all right? And then this other issue, loss and damage, all right? As we've sort of indicated, if we live in the United States, the chances of us really suffering the effects of climate change in a deep way are relatively small. But other countries, it's like this. This was the Philippines, Cyclone Haiyan in Tacloban, all right? So here's the question. People said the fingerprints of climate change were all over this storm, all right? Who pays, all right? The United States and the European Union, historically the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. What do we owe them? Anything? And what happens when this becomes more frequent, more common? Loss and damage. So one of the things that poor countries and vulnerable countries are trying to include in the Paris Agreement was some language saying, there is an obligation on the part of the historic emitters to compensate us for loss and damage. So there was loss and damage mentioned in the agreement, but there was no mention of obligation to compensate for loss and damage, all right? So that's why if you talk to people from the Philippines or from parts of India or other parts of the country of the world that are vulnerable, they're not entirely pleased with the agreement because they're most worried about this, all right? Because when that happens, we have trouble enough dealing with something like Katrina. Remember when Katrina happened? Now imagine that thing happening, greater intensity, greater frequency in the poorest countries, all right? What's going to happen? So emissions accomplished, here's the question. Ban Ki-moon says, for the first time, every country in the world has pledged to curb emissions, strengthen resilience, and join in common cause to take climate action. What was once unthinkable has become unstoppable. That we would agree on this, all right? So yes, almost all nations on the planet have agreed to do something. We're in it together. We're beginning to do something. So that was good news. Emissions accomplished? Well, some have said it's a disaster because we've set ourselves in the path, lowering that curve, but we need to get down here. And we need to get down there so fast that it's not likely to happen. But we'll see, right? That's one of the challenges. I don't know if that's an accurate representation, but that's kind of how it's presented, all right? So the folks who are kind of skeptical about this, there was a letter of 12 scientists published in the UK. These are mostly British scientists. They basically said the climate agreement was what people wanted to hear. Everybody wanted to hear there was an agreement. And they wanted to hear there was an agreement that would not require us to do really anything. We can have our cake and eat it too. Don't have to change our lifestyle, can continue to go shopping and watch the Super Bowl, and it'll be solved by somebody else in Washington or somewhere else, That's what we want to hear, and that's what we heard. And they said the unfortunate truth is things are going to get much worse. And we haven't really addressed that. Their conclusion was interesting, is that our backs are against the wall and we must now start the process of preparing for geoengineering. All right? Now this is, if you're not familiar with it, this is geoengineering is this idea that we're basically screwed and the only chance is if we invent something to basically make the carbon go away or reflect sunlight out in the atmosphere, all kinds of crazy schemes. Oops, I'll show you what some of them look like. Everything from, changing the color of clouds to make them, whoops, that's got a little ahead of the game there. There we go. Changing the color of clouds, thinning the clouds, putting things in the oceans, messing with the planet as it is to make it less likely to warm up. Now we've already screwed things up now. Is this going to be another thing that really screws things up? Well, who knows? And the problem is if we put all of our faith in the hope that someone's going to invent something to deflect, the sun's rays from the planet, then we don't do anything else, all right? And so we roll the dice and we double down on that one solution. So I tend to think that's not where we want to be putting our cards. We can do something better than, expecting this problem to be solved quickly by clever people. We live in a culture that's kind of fascinated with and really awed by technology. And yet this in some ways is not a technological problem. It's a moral and spiritual problem. It's an ethical problem. And we can't simply rely on technology to save us. All right? So yes, it's a disaster, but it's also a formal recognition of a new reality on the ground among the public, in business, and with the planet itself. It's now harder than ever to deny the reality of climate change. It's harder than ever to deny the reality of the viability of renewables and the eventual move away from fossil fuels. It's like we've sort of said, okay, this is the direction we're going. Right? We're not there yet, but we've set out on that direction. So that's the road. And Laurent Fabius, as I said, he was at the UN, the climate march in New York City. He says, our task does not end here in Paris. Indeed, our work is still ahead of us. This was one small step. I don't know why we're using roads here. We should use like bike paths or something. But a long, long trek ahead, all right? So it's a turning point, and the real work lies ahead of us, all right? So we can stop it there, but if you want to talk about prospects in the U.S. in terms of things, these are prospects for getting an agreement. Who knows? The U.S. EPA's Clean Power Plan is now kind of up in the air because the Supreme Court sort of halted implementation. That's the kind of the timeline, yada, yada, yada. So this is what I was mentioning about the Supreme Court, right? What this is going to be, who knows? I'm no expert on this, but it's something worth paying attention to. And as I mentioned before, it's really up to people in the U.S. to say, we know what's going on in the world, we know it's essential that the U.S. be involved in this, and so we need to be looking at our candidates very seriously, all right? So thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much. So let's open it up to questions then, or let him drink first.
Okay. Let's make Parisian water here.
Lots of questions.
Okay.
You
wait.
decide.
All right. Well, please.
So I noticed you had nuclear power as one of the sources of pollutants, or
Well, that was one that was, because if one option in that one slide
Right.
was saying that if we decided to go to 100% toward renewables, there are plans that have renewables plus sort of nuclear. 'Cause nuclear is kind of its own category in some way.
well, I was curious, that was
Yeah,
sort of what
it's
I
a
was
sort of
curious
its own category. And some would argue that if things really get desperate, we ought to be considering that. But
I don't want to argue that, but
yeah.
I was curious.
Yeah, that's kind of what it was. So that plan was saying, this is what we can do if we don't include nuclear. And France, obviously, they're big into nuclear, and so it's an interesting question. But there are opportunities to do this without that. Go ahead.
On Facebook, I was following the protest culture outside, and it was indeed a very organized city. And one of the major issues and war cries with it that they came away with, and they were very undercovered. But as you mentioned earlier, the indigenous people from island cultures felt they were greatly underrepresented compared to big business. And there was really a lot of corporations and big business got such weight in the matters where they were extremely marginalized.
Yeah, I mean, some of it's small numbers of relatively small numbers because it's just island nations, but they have a very different take on these things. Some of the most eloquent presentations ever made at these COPs was by representatives of the island nations, because for them it is that existential question. It's not just about lifestyle issues, or maybe we have to bike more than drive a car. It's, will their nation continue to exist?
Well, that's what they felt they
Yeah.
had far more.
Yeah, and so it's, I mean, they've had more influence than their numbers, but it's still not enough. And that because there are so many interests that have also a lot in stake. ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, huge amounts of money, huge amounts of political influence. They're giants in the room. There's no doubt about it. So what's going to happen with that? Well, the only thing that can happen with that is that outside we can decide that we are going to withdraw from fossil fuels. So we'll see how that goes. I mean, it's a huge problem. I mean, Naomi Klein's book, kind of addresses this nicely. But you're right. Yeah, that's one of the weak spots. But so, in the back, please.
Can you
I'm sorry, way in the back.
Yeah, way in the back. The people that agreed in Kyoto, and I was there,
Yeah.
they told me off the record, many of them, that we had a very funny idea that people keep agreements. So they were quite willing to agree to anything because they knew the U.S. Congress had already said we are not going to agree to this. So that's where we start from.
Yeah.
But I would like to throw in just some demographics that we should be thinking about.
Okay.
Right now, you have about 600 million people in India that don't have electricity.
Yep.
You have 2 out of 3 in Africa that do not have electricity. You can't assume those people are going to live on the edge of the jungle for the foreseeable future. And if they did, they'd burn all the jungles down, because right now they heat with either cow dung or charcoal. We're projecting 1 billion additional people in Southeast Asia and 1 billion additional people in Africa. Now, if all of those people, plus the current population, has a standard of living that comes not up to our level, but to a generally accepted level, you don't get there. And all the projections that I see on a regular basis are showing about 40% coal by 2050, about 20% nuclear, about 20% natural gas, and the rest significantly oil. Big percentage growth in renewable energy are just on the margin. They don't grow as much as the equivalent of 1 million barrels of oil additional per day.
Well, you're right. That's why it's so there's an agreement, but there's reality that has to be faced, which is why, in some ways, like I said, the assessment of the agreement is that it's a disaster. And yet, it's also the case that if we're projecting to 2050 and beyond, we don't always have a good track record of predicting what's going to happen. So the potential good news is that we can load the system enough for significant transformative change to happen. As I tell them, I gave a talk yesterday to some students who were sort of very bummed out about the prospects for the future. But I also said, when I was an undergraduate, I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And nobody expected Nelson Mandela to become the president of South Africa before the year 2000. Yet that happened. The Berlin Wall came down. It was a surprise. Women got the vote in 1920. That was a surprise. So there are all these sort of unpredictable events that do happen. Sadly, we're in a position now where we're praying for an unpredictable event. But you can load the system, increase the tension for some kind of transformation to happen. But it's not going to happen if people just sit back and wait. So that's the only thing I've got to say. But
you have had one unexpected event that's been major, and that has been fracking.
yeah. Yeah, and so there's all sorts of...
advances we've made have been based on economics, not on government policy.
Yeah, yeah. So that's why, again, government policy is one thing. This could be a change from the bottom up. We'll see. But, Miss, go ahead. You had your hand up earlier.
I wonder if you or somebody who understands our political system better than me could explain what the Supreme Court just did and what that might amount to.
Well, because really briefly, I'll give you what little I know, which is that lots of states are suing because of the EPA's Clean Power Plan. And so those are supposed to work their way through the courts. And the Supreme Court did something unprecedented, which was granted kind of a halt to stay on this even before those things had gotten through the courts, all right? So that was a surprise because it's like we haven't even looked at the merits of the suits yet, all right? So that's kind of what the Supreme Court did. Now, the reality is the timeline for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, it doesn't really take effect until 2020. So there's lots of time to deal with this, hopefully successfully. But it was a not a good step for those who were interested in sort of implementing this. So there's other information you might be able to find on that, but it's kind of in flux right now. Given that what does this mean? We have 8 justices, and will there be a new one soon or not? And so it's lots of uncertainty there. But go ahead.
Yeah, so basically, you're saying that the outlook is fairly bleak as things stand now. It's hard to be optimistic.
Well, it is hard to be optimistic.
I guess I would ask you your opinion that if there was the possibility of some pressure being applied of a change, not something miraculous, but something that could foreseeably happen, like what do you see as the things that could happen that would be most promising to make the situation somewhat more hopeful? Like where might that come from?
To make the situation somewhat more hopeful, in my sense of it, again, this is all uncharted territory, is there are going to be impacts, all right? There's the situation is just if you're paying attention to the science, which is very clear on a lot of this stuff, there will be impacts. And then the question is, how do we deal with those? Because like I said, the example of Syria, for instance, there was some climate fingerprints on that as well, because you have droughts, you have concerns like this, and then you have people who are migrating. That's going to be the biggest challenge. How can we deal with people who are migrating, who are climate refugees, all right? And if we can't learn to deal with that, some would argue that the real demise of civilization is not the climate problem, it's warfare. Because we're battling for water, battling each other for space, battling racial and ethnic tensions. If we can't deal with those human-to-human issues, then we're in trouble. We can handle some, if the waters rise, things happen on the planet. But the real challenge is the human-to-human questions. Because as we're hearing, the prospects are not great. We're going to continue to work. There's really no choice. But if we can't deal with each other, then we're really sunk. So that's my sense of it. But go ahead.
Do the oil companies have an answer to all of this?
Do they have an answer to it? Yeah. Well, their answer is we're greening ourselves. We're greening that thing. But
I mean, it's
the greenwashing, of course.
Scientific fact.
Yeah.
They have to be aware of it.
Yes.
And have they
any moral conscience? Yeah.
Any not response. They must have a legal response as well.
Yeah. Well, they will need to be held accountable. I mean, it was New York State Attorney General begun the process of investigating because there is evidence that the oil companies knew what was happening. They knew the climate science was real. They knew that using their product as directed caused public health harm. And they did not disclose that to their shareholders. And they could be held accountable for that. But that's, a long court battle. And it could be something like, eventually the tobacco industry was held accountable. And they were just as deceptive in their presentation of what they knew about smoking as the oil companies have been in what they know about the consequences of burning fossil fuels. We need to hold them accountable as well. But it will not happen if people don't pressure for that and vote for people who want to do that. It can happen, but the problem is you know, we go out and then we get in our cars and burn fossil fuel because we've all got, you know, we're sunk in it. We're marinating in all that right now. So anyway, gentleman in the back there.
No, a woman.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well,
You mentioned.
go ahead. Go ahead here, and then we'll come back to it.
So, we've heard a lot of really sort of depressing news about what's going on. I was wondering if, I mean, we have within our state a lot of tension between sort of industrialized greening versus localized small greening. There's a lot more money to be made from industrialized greening, but the localized stuff is what helps the average person and actually has more of an effect and is a lot cheaper to do. So the question I have is, what kinds of discussions and ideas were coming out of some of the things on the outside of the talks that could give us hope?
Well, what comes to mind, and I don't know if this is where you were kind of going with this, but stuff like the conversations about, you know, carbon fees, carbon taxes, until you get the real price of carbon built into things, then those industrial projects are going to look attractive. But if you do the true costs of these things, they're not attractive. Because somewhere down the line, we have to pay the price for adapting to the problems that these cheap things are creating. And so until you can build that in, you know, of course, right now in our political system, the idea of a carbon tax, it's like, you know, this reflex, you can't do that. But, you know, James Hansen came out with a wonderful idea, which is, yes, you have a carbon tax, but it's a dividend too. So it doesn't enlarge the government. You've got your fossil fuels, and you got to pay more. Everybody has to pay more. But if you don't use much, you get money back, all right? So it just kind of spins. And so it moves people toward renewables quickly because you save money doing that. And then you get your dividends, all right? And so if you're deep, you know, if you're knee deep in fossil fuels, then you got to pay higher. So that kind of stuff would do something. And the reality is that kind of thing could happen very soon if we demanded it.
Just
Yeah.
you know, what I was talking
Oh,
about
right then.
was things like industrial wind and very, very large mega solar projects.
Yeah.
As opposed to, say, taking all of those solar panels and putting 2 solar panels in everybody's house, which would make the state more affordable and reduce the same amount of carbon and actually affect people because people don't necessarily even using that energy. It's being sold out, you know. And in order to do that, you then have to put in big giant power line systems, which causes more damage to the environment and takes down more trees. But then, you know, the power companies don't get to make any money off of
Well, that's right, no. Well, I mean, well, there you go. It's you know, the local efforts are almost the best because it decentralizes it. Ultimately, it's safer. And yet people will have to want to do that. And there have to be, you know, so political signals saying this is good. Are there tax breaks for people who want to do solar and wind in their neighborhoods and regions? I mean, as you know, the fossil fuels get enormous subsidies. That's that. But even, you know, with the giant kind of renewables, it does seem more attractive because we're in the habit of letting other people do stuff. This is an educational challenge as well. We need people to be much more engaged politically to address the challenges. And, you know, we tend to be happy to watch the Super Bowl and let other people take care of business. So that's our own fault. But go ahead, that, and then we'll get a woman over here.
You mentioned the role of popular movements like the People's Climate March.
Yeah.
And I know Naomi Klein said in the lead up to the summit that that the role of the popular movements was really to force the government leaders to be more proactive.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if, 2 questions there. In your role at the summit, were you aware of that happening? Did you see evidence of people sort of responding to what the protesters and the popular people?
Well, it's not so much direct because, I mean, at the actual COP meetings, there's sort of agreements about limitations on protesting in a sense. But otherwise you get kicked out. But yeah. But I mean, it was unfortunate because of the events that happened in November. There were lots and lots and lots of marches planned and efforts, but the permits for that were basically retracted because the French police couldn't guarantee anybody's safety. That was the line, all right? So even so, a lot of the non-governmental organizations that are involved are functioning as lobbyists, all right? They're not directly involved in the negotiating, but they're holding press conferences, they're putting out newsletters, they're, sort of stopping people in the hallways. There's ways of kind of applying pressure to the people who were doing things. But it's a difficult process because you've got, like I said, 195 nations. Many of them are acting in blocks. They're the least developed countries. They're the island nations. There's a lot going on. It's very complicated. But that kind of stuff has had an impact. But as we heard earlier, you've still got huge business interests represented there as well. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, not a friend of climate policy. They're there too. So it's tough, but which is why the people who have the numbers need to be out doing things if you want something different. And so the climate march was good, but the Chamber of Commerce is active every day. And it was only one march, but you had a question here.
Yes, I'm wondering if you have any kinds of recommendations for those of us who are involved in the public school system. I don't know if you know, but many school systems don't teach any kind of science.
Yep.
In the elementary school. They don't teach any kind of social studies in the elementary school. The kinds of science that's taught at the high school level is often also very constricted. So what can we do to help our school children understand that this is a problem that they need to be involved in?
Okay, well, real quick on this, you kind of hit my sweet spot. I'm actually a professor of education. I am by training a philosopher of education. So to think about this, so real quick, run down the things. One, you don't talk about this with elementary school students. You don't burden the world's, little kids with the world's problems. That's adult stuff. So what do you do with elementary kids? If you find people who are environmental activists, people who are passionate about them, and you ask them to tell their story, it almost always goes back to something when they were young. They have positive experiences with the world. They've fallen in love with nature or their neighborhood. They have positive experiences, and you get them outside. So you don't have to talk about climate change. I'm not a scientist, all right? I'm interested in this stuff because when I was a kid, I came home from school and did not watch TV for 5 hours or play video games. I went out and climbed trees and built tree houses and drank water in the stream and got sick from drinking water in the stream and did all that kind of stuff. Kids, kids these days aren't having that. They have sort of an intellectual or maybe an abstract understanding of these big things. They might care about climate change, but if you don't have an affection for the world, we're in trouble. It's got to come from a place of love. All right, I'll say that up front because it's not an intellectual challenge. The only reason people will continue to do something is if they feel it in their hearts. All right? And so what kids need to do at the elementary level, middle school level, yes, lots of time outdoors, falling in love with the world. And when you get to high school, then we can start talking about this. The science isn't there yet, but we're doing our best. All right?
Forgive me, I just want to make a comment.
Please.
Yes, very important. I think your point is very important. In my opinion, we should start this process as early as possible. And I just want to share with you that in Japan, government had stopped nuclear system because of the risk that involved. They teach the children from first grade that 10 minutes every morning we do the cleaning of our school and perhaps once a week of the environment. And they are teaching them slowly as to how to deal and keep the world beautiful. I think we could do something without getting to the scientific aspects of it. I think it is very important to start teaching our children as early as possible the issues and the risks, however you think is possible. Sorry about that.
That's fine, that's great. So, please, go ahead.
As I understand it, the best place to sequester carbon is in the soil, and any organic farmer knows how to do this and has been doing it since I was a kid. And so relative to school children, having a garden.
Oh, yes.
And watching how the soil builds. And there's a film from permaculture called Inhabit, which I just saw. and there's a tiny snippet there of a permaculture man who had no animals, and he was watching what happened with the grasses, and they would oxidize. But when he brought in sheep, then the sheep ate the grasses, and as he said, out of the rear end came soil.
Yeah.
And so this is the thing that gives me some hope.
Yeah.
That if we tune into permaculture and organic farmers, that the carbon that's in this air will then come and be in the soil, and soil fertility will have been built up.
Yeah, there's lots of folks who are looking at essentially mimicking the way nature does things, which is really what we ought to be doing. There's conversations about biochar and other kinds of stuff to really get carbon back in the soil and back into trees and other things where it's safe and doing good things for us. So those kinds of things are all moving ahead, but they still really are on the fringe. And it's important that they be kind of ramped up to much more significant levels. But you're absolutely right. But please, yeah.
So first of all, thank you for an excellent presentation.
Oh, thanks.
It made clear so much to me. Maybe just two footnotes very quickly. It's my understanding that warfare is an incredible polluter.
Yeah.
Did they talk about that at all?
Not per se that I know. I mean, there were lots of things that were excluded, including like shipping and air travel.
Yeah.
Oddly, but warfare is a huge polluter, and I think in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, that issue sort of gets included, but it's as far as I know, not something that they're really talking about in terms of like emissions reductions, except when you talk about like financing. Folks at like World Watch Institute are saying, we can address these problems. We think $100 billion is a lot. You look at, again, U.S. military budget. It's a lot more than that. And this is $100 billion globally, all right? And so shifting even a little bit to a culture of peace and away from the culture of war would release funds to do something. And at some point, it's going to have to happen. But in the war, we can't deal with the human questions. We need to be able to live together as neighbors. And the hopeful side is, this is something that the entire planet can agree on because it's the one thing we all have in common. All right? We need a planetary civilization, not one dominated by nation states. We haven't always had nation states. They're dividing. So how do you move to a planetary civilization? That's an incredible leap in consciousness, but that's where we need to go. And education needs to catch up with that because it's not looking good right now. But anyway, question? Go ahead.
Well, thank you. Again, I want to echo the thanks for your presentation. Really wonderful. My name's Ian Hitchcock. I'm an undergraduate here at Marlboro, trying to study climate change with some of the interdisciplinary breadth and depth, not the Ph.D. as you described.
Okay.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the demographics that gives me hope, which is my generation, your students, millennials. I care a lot about climate change to the point that I've devoted my education to it and devote my career and professional life to try to address some of these issues. And I know I'm not alone.
Yeah.
I know that concern about how we deal with the moral, ethical, and kind of material challenges of climate change is incredibly galvanizing for people of my generation. And I'm wondering what you see as the role of kind of up-and-coming millennials, of students and soon-to-be graduates, are in this struggle.
Yeah.
What can we do as students and young people to make a positive contribution to try to solve this problem? Is it enough to go out and canvass for Bernie and go vote for him?
Yeah, well, it needn't be that, that's cool, but it needn't be that. Everybody's got a role to play, and it doesn't mean everybody has to become a climate scientist or a climate political activist, because I remember we had Richard Louv, author of Last Child in the Woods, was a big book not too long ago, said because of climate change and other problems, everything must change, all right? So the good news in a sense is that he says this could be the most creative period in human history, all right? Because we need to reinvent everything. And so it's a matter of following your passion, but doing that with something sort of bigger in mind. You look around these days and it's kind of the time of greatest distraction. We live in the era of distraction. But there's an opportunity to take part in, an incredible period in history. People will look back in 200 years, hopefully they'll be here, and say either, we frittered away an opportunity and just hidden our phones and TVs, or we saw what was coming and we're part of an incredible generation, all right? So that's kind of our choice. So young people have an opportunity to participate in something that is really much, much larger than themselves, and that's what everybody wants in their life, is to do something meaningful. But that needs to happen in the healthcare fields, in education, as we talked about, in business, in every field. We need to be doing something differently. And so it doesn't mean everybody has to shift to climate science. That's not going to solve it, because there are health challenges and clean water challenges. So look at those sustainable development goals and say, how can we all contribute something there? Because all of those fit together, and we need to begin making those connections. So I think being able to articulate this time as a period of sort of great transition and being at the forefront of that, that's a legacy. So it's worth fighting for. It's not World War II. It's not that kind of a challenge. It's there you had people who were putting guns at your head to a certain extent. This climate change is tough, because when you look outside, it looks fine. In some ways, it just doesn't seem to be in our faces. And so one of the challenges is breaking through that and seeing the reality of things. And so putting ourselves in situations where we have to confront that, and helping people kind of break through the noise. So it's a time of waking up. So I think if young people can see that, it's a tremendous opportunity, all right? So I mean, it's what motivates me, and so thank you for doing what you're doing. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I had, there was a comment made over here earlier about industrial green power versus local. It really brings up, I think, a dilemma, because you had pointed out that big corporations are looking for that market signal to invest. Well, when they get that market signal, they're looking for a profit. And what we're looking for is the markets to drive innovation. But that innovation is not going to be on a micro level.
That's right.
It will be on a macro level, for good or for ill. So we really do have to reconcile if we're thinking the solution is an individual-based process. I don't think we're going to find that, but that means we're going to have to accept the fact that we are going to have an Exxon Mobil of solar power, or a BP of wind power.
Yeah, I mean, it's these are the kinds of questions, because I hear this, it's like it's hard to be pure about it. Like, I would rather have the kind of Exxon Mobil of wind and have no fossil fuels. But there are other things that we can have, and it's possible to have a more mixed system as well. I think we need to, as a matter of national security, sort of decentralize the power system. The Pentagon is up on climate change, all right? They know what's going on. They have to be concerned about this. So from their perspective, and I've heard some really interesting presentations by people who say, we've got to be looking at this in all different angles. And it's not necessarily a good thing to have industrialized systems of any kind, because they're vulnerable. So how do you decentralize that? How do you make that profitable for individuals and for businesses to make a decent return? But that's when you have to reinvent the corporation. I mean, this is one of the big problems. The B Corps, that are chartered for economic, social, and environmental purposes. That's what we need to move toward. If it's only about the bottom line, there's going to be a problem. This is what Naomi Klein is writing about in her book, and so reinventing those businesses has to happen. Otherwise, you're just going to have these giants who are making compromises with our health and safety and life and everything all the time. So that's got to be a piece of it. And that's why we need young people to reinvent the corporation, or maybe de-invent it or something. But so, final thoughts? Good.
One question over. I think he worked enough. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
Most grateful. We usually have a basket of food and fruit for our speakers, but this gentleman didn't wanted just some maple syrup from them.
Thank you very much.
Organic, that's right, and local.
Given an offer to us by our board member here, Nicholas Porter, who was very kind to offer some of his own handmade syrup. Before you go, please let me let you know that we are working very hard on our website, windhamworldaffairscouncil.org. Please take a look at it, hear and read about all the present, past speakers, and our future speakers. Please share with us any opinion you have and any thought that you want to share with us. We appreciate that. Please remember that everybody here is volunteer, and we offer our love, friendship, some food, some drink. And those of you who have not paid your annual dues, please don't forget that. Have a nice day, and thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we scored. Oh, thank you.
Absolutely superb.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, appreciate it.